If you don't like the practice of rebates that I talked about in our previous slide, you would probably turn to the government for help. However, which level of government are you going to go talk to? Well, probably the state governments, because after all, the states are the closest to you when it comes to your governments. So some of the small businessmen will go to their state governments and actually convince state governments to pass laws to regulate the railroads, right? But the problem is that these railroad companies are going to hear about the law. They're going to hire expensive lawyers, and these lawyers are going to go to the courts, and they're going to tell, and then the courts are going to turn around and find that these state laws are unconstitutional. Why are they unconstitutional? Well, it's because what are the fundamental nature of railroads? What do railroads do? They go from point A to point B. Now, most likely, if you're talking about railroads that are transporting freight, they're going to cross over a state line. So whenever that happens, that's called interstate commerce. And under the Constitution, the only level of government that can regulate state commerce, of course, is going to be the federal government. So what do these little businessmen do? They complain to the federal government because they're the ones that are supposed to regulate this. Well, the United States government is going to react with what's known as the Interstate Commerce Act, creating the Interstate Commerce Commission. It's important to us because it's the first time that the federal government gets involved in regulating the economy. Now, the problem is going to be with this Interstate Commerce Commission is the fact that we have to put people that know the railroads onto these interstate commerce commissions. After all, you're not going to regulate the railroads by putting people that know steamboats well, right? No, you need people that know the railroad business in order to regulate the railroad business. Well, doesn't that kind of sound like the inmates running the asylum, the foxes who are guarding the chicken coop here? Well, so it's kind of like a 2 steps forward but 1 step back type of thing. But nevertheless, the interstate commerce, it doesn't really matter that much. But nevertheless, over time, we're going to see that it's going to become more important. And so the interstate commerce is our first step towards the creation of a national welfare regulatory state. Now, at the time as well, this is continuing our negative aspects of industrialization is the creation of gigantic corporations. Now, back then, they're called trusts. It gets into the language today, right? For example, if General Motors, were to try to buy out Ford Motor Company, the antitrust division of the Justice Department is going to step in, and it's going to say, can't do it. That's too big of a market share being controlled by one company. I believe AT&T tried to buy out T-Mobile not too long ago, right? And what did the federal government do? They stepped in. They said, no, that would be too much of a market share concentrated in one company, right? So during the Gilded Age, you have something that's known as a trust. And if you look it up in the dictionary, this is, it's going to tell you that a trust is a property interest held by the one person for the benefit of another. This is pioneered by our hero/villain, John D. Rockefeller. What happens was that Rockefeller starts with one corporation in Ohio. But remember, he owns 90% of the oil refining in this country. Do you suppose that everything that he owns is in Ohio? No! By the late 1870s, he has property in 13 states and several foreign countries. Now, what do you do, therefore, in order to have a corporation? What's the first thing you need to do? You need to have a charter, some sort of organization, a piece of paper that organizes your corporation. And the charter basically stated that Standard Oil could not own property in other states, and it could not own stock in other companies. But wait a minute. Rockefeller owned 40 different companies. They are in violation of their own charter. So to get around it, Rockefeller's attorneys come up with the idea of a trust. This consisted of 9 of his closest friends, his closest golfing buddies, right? Labeled the board of trustees. Rockefeller and his closest associates, in which they would take all the stock that they owned and all the companies that Standard Oil had control over and turn it over to these board of trustees, right? Now, who decides who runs a country, how a company behaves, right? It's the stockholders. And these 9 men held the stock in trust. They ran the whole darn thing. If you're a stockholder and you gave over your stock, it's not a bad thing. You're still receiving dividends. You've just given up control of the company. Now, when set up, a trust was not legal, but it was also not illegal. There was no law because of the fact that there really was never something like this before. It's very hard to pass a law on something that has never existed. So it's kind of extra legal. This is the kind of the genius of Rockefeller, the fact that he was always a step ahead of the game. Now, when Rockefeller sets up his trusts, other industries are going to do the same thing. And pretty soon you're going to have trusts everywhere. Whiskey trust, farm machinery trust. I mean, name it, you name it, there's going to be a trust for these companies in these industries. Now, trusts can do good things. They can give steady employment. They can produce things efficiently. But they could also do bad things. Couldn't they just charge whatever they wanted to since, hey, they control the whole market? Once the public found out about this, they're going to scream to high heaven. And they told Congress, do something about it. Congress responds with what's known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. Here's what a part, don't worry, I'm going to read a part of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It says here, every contract combinations in the form of trusts or otherwise in restraint of trade among the several states or with foreign nations is hereby declared to be illegal. That's pretty clear, don't you think? Not really. It's pretty darn vague if you ask me. Guess who eventually has to determine what a restraint of trade is? Well, the courts. The Supreme Court, for example, would have to decide what it is, and when it will it has to also depend on who's sitting on these courts. It's a law that's meant to be interpreted. And by the way, the penalty for violating this Sherman Antitrust Act is a fine of $5,000. When you consider the fact that Rockefeller is making $50 million a year, I don't know about that. I don't think Rockefeller's really going to worry about it too much. But of course, the 1 year in jail could certainly pique your interest. But nevertheless, if you're, the really important part about this act is that if your company is found in violation of this act, it had to be broken apart. Your companies had to basically go back to competing with one another. Now, for the first 10 years of the existence of this law, it didn't mean jack. Okay, but however, just like this, the Interstate Commerce Commission, it's on the books. It's there. All it needs is somebody to come in and actually enforce the law. Because afterwards, the laws do not enforce themselves. Rather, it depends on the person that's in charge to enforce the law. Now, Rockefeller in the 1890s would have to break up his trust and be able to move it into a holding company. And at first, it kind of looks like a trust. The definition of a holding company is this: one corporation that holds stock in another corporation. It's not legal in all states, but it's legal in New Jersey. So Rockefeller moved to New Jersey, where he set up Standard Oil of New Jersey. This is the parent company, by the way, of ExxonMobil. Then all the stock from all the other Rockefeller's companies were given over to Standard Oil of New Jersey. And Standard Oil of New Jersey was run by a board comprised of companies so that they could of Rockefeller and his closest associates. They owned all the stock in the companies, and they called the shots. And the holding company was legal in New Jersey, but it can still violate the law if it crossed any provision of the Sherman Antitrust Act, depending on how a court might interpret it. In any event, the holding company is the form of the monopoly we have today, giant corporations that we have today. So monopoly power is certainly one negative aspect. We have some other negative aspects. For example, the affecting the environment. I mean, it's a major debate today about what's causing climate change, right? Well, industrialization is going to also cause an extremes in wealth and poverty. For example, in 1901, John D. Rockefeller's income was $50 million in 1901 dollars, right? There's not an income tax. There's no federal income tax in 1901. So as far as the federal government's concerned, John Rockefeller gets to keep that money. An unskilled worker in one of Rockefeller's refineries working 60 hours a week makes $500 a year. Now, let's put that in today's perspective. We're talking about $10,000 a year for the unskilled worker versus $1 billion for Rockefeller. Did I kind of tell you what's going on? And then speaking of the environment, I mentioned that earlier. Let's talk about it just briefly. Industrialization has tremendous negative impacts on the environment in numerous ways. And like I said, we are still debating this. But one thing we can actually agree upon is what it can do to water quality, right? For example, in Cleveland, there is the Cuyahoga River. And the Cuyahoga River has the dubious dubious distinction of being the first river to be declared a fire hazard. Let me say that again. A river being declared a fire hazard. What are rivers made out of? And what do we use to put out fire? Water, right? Well, guess what? There's so much pollutants in the river, in the Cuyahoga River, that it actually catches fire occasionally. So in 1969, it stops. It's one of the biggest fires that happens on it, and it really gets Americans' attention in terms of trying to better our environment. This is the kind of things that industrialization can do to an environment when you don't regulate it.